A deep silence enveloped the small town of Westfield, nestled among green meadows and surrounded by dense forests. At first glance, the place seemed idyllic, but beneath this shell of calm lurked a dark secret that made the hearts of the residents beat harder with fear. In the past few months, Westfield had been the scene of several mysterious murders. The victims varied from men, women, young and old. There was nothing in common between them except one thing: they were all found with an identical tattooed mark on their wrist. This mark, in the form of a mysterious symbol, began to appear on the bodies of the victims after their deaths, like the signature of a mysterious killer. The town's sheriff, Jacobs, investigated, but each new case became more complex and confusing. The people of Westfield lived in constant fear, locking their doors at night and trying not to go outside after sundown. One evening, as the town was sinking into darkness, the sheriff received an anonymous letter. It said that the killer was among the citizens of Westfield, and his next victim had already been chosen. Jacobs felt that time was short and he must act quickly. He questioned every resident, made enquiries, but found nothing anywhere that could help him in his investigation. The letter was written without any clues or hints. Fear and distrust engulfed the town, and the residents began to suspect each other. Days turned into nights and nights into days, but the murders continued. Jacobs faced the fact that even close friends and neighbors began to look at him with suspicion. He was on the verge of despair, realizing that perhaps the killer was sitting right in front of his nose. But then one day, when the town had already resigned itself to the idea that this nightmare might have no end, the killings suddenly stopped. The tattooed mark no longer appeared on the bodies of the new victims, and the city fell back into silence. Still, the shadow of the recent nightmare hung over Westfield. No one knew where the serial killer might be, and fear once again entered the hearts of the residents. Sheriff Jacobs continued his investigation, but the answers seemed to slip away like a shadow in the woods, and the mystery of the serial killer remained unsolved. Years passed, but the mystery of the serial killer remained unsolved. Life in Westfield was slowly returning to normal, but the shadow of the past continued to loom in the back of every resident's mind. Sheriff Jacobs never gave up his investigation. He conducted interviews, watching for every new sign that could point to a possible killer, but the answers remained inscrutable. Some residents changed their residences, others began to shut themselves away, afraid to even whisper about past events. One day, a wave of murders erupted again. Now it seemed even more violent than before. The mark of the killer reappeared on each victim's body as a portent of imminent tragedy. Sheriff Jacobs felt time working against him, and once again he sank into the shadows of his past failed investigation. The town descended into chaos and fear. Residents were beginning to suspect each other again, and an atmosphere of general mistrust filled the streets of Westfield. The desperate sheriff tried to find any trace of him, but the killer seemed to be a trap-dodging ghost hiding in the shadows. With each new murder, the town lost hope. Families lurked in their homes, shutting themselves off from the world, and in the evenings the streets of the town became empty and dead. Only the light of street lamps illuminated the dark corners where the killer might be hiding. Sheriff Jacobs continued his solitary investigation, immersed in the darkness of the night, where every rustle or shadow could prove to be a clue. But the deeper he dug, the harder it became to distinguish truth from lies. So the town of Westfield continued to live on, waiting for the killer's next strike, immersed in the shadow of an unsolved mystery that seemed to cling to this tiny corner of the world forever. Sheriff Jacobs continued his agonizing search, but the killer outpaced him at every turn. The nights merged into one vast shadow where every sound seemed to whisper riddles. Jacobs was lost in this dark game, realizing that the killer was always one step ahead. One day, in the middle of the night, when the town was engulfed in a thick haze, Sheriff Jacobs found himself face to face with the one he had been so desperate to find. A dark figure stood in the shadows, and only the flickering light of a torch illuminated its face, slowly rising to the top of its hood. "Sheriff," said a mysterious voice that sounded like an echo of the darkness itself. "You've been looking for me for a long time." Jacobs remained motionless, his hand clutching the hilt of his weapon, but he didn't have time to reach for it. The assassin stepped forward, whispering cryptic words that sounded like curses. "Did you think you could catch me, Jacobs? But you were wrong. I've been here all along, watching your every move." The sheriff felt fear and ignorance slowly engulf him. All his certainties and plans crumbled like dust in the wind. "Why?" whispered the sheriff, trying to make sense of this vast tragedy. "Why?" the assassin replied, as if mocking. "Some questions have no answer, Sheriff. Life is a game, and in that game I play my part." The dark figure began to slowly fade into the shadows, seeming to dissolve into them. Sheriff Jacobs remained standing in the barren darkness, unable to move. "You can't stop me, Jacobs," the killer said, and his voice became a dark whisper disappearing into the night. "The game will continue until I play my last card." Then darkness swallowed the figure, leaving Sheriff Jacobs in the gloom of his own inner shadows. The mystery remained unsolved, and the town of Westfield continued to wait for the killer's next move in this vast game of fate. Sheriff Jacobs remained standing in the gloom, as if swallowed by the darkness. The mysterious killer was gone, but his words continued to echo in Jacobs' mind like a curse clutching his heart. Now the sheriff was obsessed with the idea that his small town was in the grasp of an unknown evil, and he had been summoned to solve the mystery. Every glowing eye in the darkness, every rustle of leaves in the forest seemed to him suspicious signs. He stopped sleeping, becoming on the lookout for the night, searching for signs of this mysterious killer. The town was suffering from the strain, and Sheriff Jacobs was growing weary. He spent sleepless nights in his office, studying all the data available to him, poring over evidence, hoping to find some trace. But the killer remained elusive, like a ghost lurking in the shadows. Jacobs faced mistrust and suspicion from his subordinates. He was losing touch with reality, becoming a prisoner of his own obsession. Life in Westfield had come to a standstill, as if time had stood still in the moment when the mysterious killer had spoken his last words. The sheriff realized that his solitary struggle against an unknown evil was becoming increasingly hopeless. But something inside him wouldn't let him give up. He felt that the answer to the riddle was somewhere nearby, in the dark corners of his own mind, and continued his obsessive struggle against the darkness, unknown and dangerous. So the town of Westfield continued to teeter on the edge of light and shadow, and Sheriff Jacobs sank deeper and deeper into the dark waters of his own obsession, not knowing what awaited him at the end of this vast labyrinth. Sheriff Jacobs continued his futile search, but at some point he managed to find a small clue. Among the piles of papers and evidence, he found a strange drawing that showed a house on the outskirts of town. There was something unusual about this house that caught the sheriff's attention. Following that bright spot in the darkness, Jacobs found himself on the outskirts of Westfield, in front of an old, abandoned house. Shadows of dark woods framed its walls, creating an atmosphere full of mystery and danger. The sheriff, wary of his surroundings, began to investigate this house, as if within its walls lurked the answer to a perennial question. Entering the house, the sheriff felt the darkness and silence engulf him. Step by step he made his way upwards, to the cluttered floors, until he reached the basement. An unknown force was pulling him down, to a place where perhaps the truth was hiding. Opening the cellar door, he saw a terrible sight. In a dark corner lay the remains of some of the missing people. The smell of decomposition filled the air, and pale bones glistened in the darkness. The sheriff rose, realizing that he had stepped into the territory of darkness. Fireflies flickered amidst the gloom of the basement as witnesses to the countless horrors that had taken place here. Jacobs felt the pitiful light of his torch empathize with the dead silence of the place. He knew the truth now, but it was dark and ominous. The killer, like a shadow lurking in the shadows, lived right under the noses of the townsfolk. The sheriff realized that now a new phase of his struggle was beginning, in which he would come face to face with the one who had remained in the shadows for so long. He looked around every corner of the house, gathering every possible clue. But at the same time, he could feel the darkness of the place beginning to take its toll on his mind. The light of the torch flickered like a flickering candle in a storm, and the sheriff realized that this path could lead him to plunge into the darkest depths of his own soul. Sheriff Jacobs, numbed by what he had seen in the basement, realized that now his own safety was also in question. He resolutely climbed the stairs out of the gloom of the basement and began to hide in the shadows, waiting for more events to unfold. As the killer made his way home, the sheriff reached for the radio with a trembling hand and tried to call for reinforcements. But the darkness and tension made him whisper uncertainly into the radio microphone. He realized that now every rustle could herald the approach of danger. The assassin, back home, had no idea that his hideout had been discovered. He moved shadowily through the corridors of his home like a sinister spirit, carrying with him the odor of death and decay. The dark walls of the house had witnessed many secrets, and now the sheriff decided it was time to reveal them. The sheriff glided through the dark corridors, carefully avoiding contact with the killer. His torch flickered faintly, cutting through the darkness, and every sound, whether it was the slight creak of a door or the rustle of wind, made his heartbeat even faster. The killer, unaware that he was being pursued, entered his dark basement where the remains of his victims lay. The sheriff, hiding in the shadows, listened tensely to his every move. He sensed that this moment would be the turning point in this mad game of fate. How would the sheriff proceed from here? Fight the killer or continue to hide in the darkness, a victim of his own obsession? The answers lurked within him like dark secrets waiting to be revealed. Sheriff Jacobs, torch clutched in his hand, crept cautiously into the dark corners of the house, hiding from the killer's gaze. He was but a shadow slipping in the darkness, watching every movement of his grim opponent. In the flickering light of the torch, the sheriff could see the killer surveying his basement. There, in the dark corners, lay the remains of those who had fallen victim to his insane crimes. The smell of death hung in the air, creating an ominous atmosphere in the place. The sheriff continued to follow the killer's every move, feeling his every heartbeat matching the menacing rhythm of the darkness. He had no clear plan, but he knew he couldn't stop. Every second was now worth its weight in gold. The killer, as if sensing the sheriff's presence, slowed his movements. His gut instinct told him something was wrong. The sheriff held his breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The dark shadow moved in the basement like a player in a confusing game, and the sheriff knew he had a part to play in this dangerous performance. In the darkness he stayed, remaining an invisible observer of the secrets this house held in its fathomless depths. Sheriff Jacobs, sitting in the shadows, cautiously watched the murderer, who seemed to be beginning to comprehend something unusual. The killer stopped suddenly, as if sensing a look directed in his direction. The sheriff felt goosebumps, realizing that his silent hunt might be detected. Suddenly the assassin, as if sensing the sheriff's presence, slowly turned in his direction. His eyes flickered with the reflections of the pale light of the torch, and the darkness around him seemed even thicker. The sheriff's heart raced. He was one-on-one with the one who had brought death to their small town. The assassin's gaze pierced the darkness like an arrow, and the sheriff felt that gaze pass through his hiding shadow of concealment. There was a tense silence in the darkness. The sheriff and the assassin stood facing each other, separated by the dark room. There was something unknowable in that stillness, as if the air were filled with the energy of an unknown danger. The darkness of the house seemed to obey the killer's will as his staunch ally, and the sheriff realized that now, in this moment, he had become part of that dark symphony that the killer was compassing in his madness. Seconds stretched like hours in that tense silence, interrupted only by the rustles of the ancient walls. And suddenly the silence was shattered as the assassin walked slowly but determinedly toward the sheriff. Sheriff Jacobs lunged forward, strength and determination filling his body. Gripping the hilt of his weapon, he met the assassin's gaze. Two dark entities clashed in the gloom, creating a whirlwind of a fight that seemed to be a fight not for life, but for death. The assassin was as agile as a ghost, dodging the sheriff's blows and retaliating with unexpected strikes. The sheriff, for his part, used every experience, every skill, to hold back the darkness that tried to consume him. The ancient walls of the house groaned as if in response to the ominous symphony of this battle. The light of the torch flickered, illuminating the pictures of the instant fighting like footage from a nightmare. The fight continued, each blow was filled with tension, their breath mingled in the air, creating an atmosphere of frantic struggle around them. In this darkness, amidst the mysteries of the house and the ancient walls, the sheriff and the assassin unfolded their fateful battle. The battle and the darkness continued, and finally Sheriff Jacobs was able to overcome the terror that had dominated their quiet town for years. With sudden determination, he struck the final, decisive blow that sent the killer into the darkness of his own darkness. The assassin's body collapsed to the floor, and at that moment the sheriff felt the weight of his victory. He stood over his defeated foe, but his eyes flickered with signs of pain and exhaustion. This victory had cost him dearly. Gathering the last remnants of his strength, the sheriff examined his wounds. Blood was slowly draining from the deep cuts and bruises. He could feel the strength leaving his body, as if carrying him into the unknown. The killer lay breathless, but his dark legacy remained in the air, like a ghost carrying the shadow of long years. The sheriff, for his part, was defeated by his own obsession and the price he had to pay for the peace of his small town. Now Sheriff Jacobs stood alone in that dark room, facing the consequences of his choices. The last flame of determination burned in his eyes, but at the same time, as he felt the fire dimming, he realized that the price of victory had been high, and now he was part of his own shadow that he had left behind him. Wounded and exhausted, Sheriff Jacobs left the dark walls of the house at dawn. The air was permeated with freshness, and the first rays of sunlight slowly dispelled the darkness of night. Step by step, he walked out of the ominous hideout, as if climbing out of a web of secrets. Sitting down on the porch of the house, the sheriff pulled a packet of cigarettes from his pocket. His hand trembled, but he managed to light the cigarette anyway. The smoke rose in the air, mixing with the light morning mist. The sheriff stared off into the distance, his gaze sliding over the sleeping city. Each house, each street seemed to him like a piece of a larger puzzle that might never be fully put together. He thought about the sacrifices he had had to make to stop this nightmare. The strength was gone from his body, but the sheriff's gaze remained determined. He reflected on the fact that the dark shadow of the killer may have vanished, but its traces could still be felt in every corner of the city. He realized that this struggle had left irreparable wounds in him, and he was facing the new reality of his own dark soul. Sitting by the porch, Sheriff Jacobs lit another cigarette and looked up at the rising sun, as if searching for answers in its light. The town's dark past now lay in ruins, and the sheriff, left to face his own demons, wondered what the future might bring.